Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Biblio Files, a show from the Ann Arbor District Library in Michigan that's all about books. Each episode, we try to read books on one particular theme, and this time we are reading books in verse. I'm Christopher, and I'm joined as always by Amanda and Lucy, and we have a special guest today, Evelyn. So, Amanda, what book did you read for us today?
So I'm a fan of novels in verse, and I was excited to pick one for this episode. And I chose a teen novel called Apple, Skin to the Core, written by Eric Gansworth. And this book, it's in the teen section, which is kind of I don't know if it belongs or fits exactly with the YA, but that's a whole discussion people are having online anyway. But the book it won a 2021 Prince Honor Book in the teen category, which is awesome. And the book it's a memoir in verse. So it tells the story of the author's life growing up in an Onondaga family living among the Tuscaroras in the Niagara Falls region near Buffalo, New York. And it talks about his family history. And there's a huge insight as to just the indigenous experience in the US. The author was born in 1965, so it talks about growing up. It talks about his family, and all three of his four grandparents had experiences within the government-run boarding schools, which were terrible. The book, it's not quite, some of the other novels in verse that I've read are shorter, briefer, are a little less dense, and are more poetic versus essay style. And I felt like this was telling his story more in shorter essays with poems attached to them. He talks about growing up. There's a lot of pop culture strewn throughout the book. As a kid, he's the youngest of 7 kids on the reservation, and his older siblings are a lot older than him. Like some of his siblings are having kids that are around his age. So he's a lot younger. His dad is pretty absent. He's around, but he is working a lot and I guess lives up the street somewhere. So it's him, and he's obsessed with Batman. He also gets doted upon by all of his siblings. They don't have a lot of money. Their house is very piece worked and put together, but there's a lot of people around on the street he lives on the reservation, so there's lots of cousins and siblings and people and elders. He's obsessed with Batman as a child. He loves reading comics. That's sort of his escape. He feels different, and he sort of identifies as being an alien or an outsider, so he gets super into David Bowie and Kiss and the Monkees. The main pop culture reference in this book is to the Beatles. The title is Apple, Skin to the Core. Apple is a slur for Native American, red on the outside, white on the inside. But for this book, he also uses that analogy for the Beatles, because the Beatles eventually run a record label called Apple Recordings, I think. So there's some illustrations of apples in the books that he's created. I liked the book a lot more than I thought I would. I loved hearing his experiences and growing up. And part of why I say I'm not sure it quite fits the teen, it's totally suitable and appropriate for teens. But being set like so much in the 60s and 70s, and it does go into when he's a little bit older, but there's so many pop culture references, and the way the book is organized, it's sort of like an album, a record album, and he talks a lot about the White Album and the Beatles. It's just really interesting the way the book is laid out. But the book, I really enjoyed the book. I love reading about his experience. I like the way it was crafted. Even if he did have poems to go with some of the essays he had, the poems were directly sort of a related translation in poem form, that translation of the essay, if that makes any sense. Anyways, I really enjoyed the book. The book is called Apple, Skin to the Core. And yeah, if you want to read about a Native American experience in the US from the 60s through now, this will be the book for you. Evelyn, what did you choose?
So I did a reread of a book that I read. This is my 3rd time reading it. I read it maybe once every 10 years, called The Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. So I read it first when I was probably like 17, and then again in my mid-20s, and then now. And it's a retelling of the Greek myth of Hercules slaying Geryon, and I don't know the myth outside of really of like this telling of it, but in this telling, it's like, so Geryon is a red-winged monster in the original like Greek myth, and it's one of Hercules's 10 like things that he has to do. One of his 10 trials is to slay this monster. But in this retelling in verse, it's about them as basically like young. It's about Geryon as this young boy who is red and has wings, but other than that is growing up sort of in like a normal family, normal, everything else is kind of normal. And then he meets Heracles and they fall in love kind of as young, like teenagers. And then it's just sort of like their love story, and it ends before the slaying, although you find out in the very beginning about it. A lot of it has gone over my head every time I've read it because I'm not that familiar with like the classics, like the Greek classics. But I get something different out of it every time I read it. This time was the first time I've read it since I became a mother. And there's a lot of it in there about like the relationship between Geryon and his mother. And it's really sad in a lot of ways, but it's also really beautiful. And another thing about it that just has really struck me every time I've read it is that it's this like young, like queer love story between these two boys. It was written in 1998. Anne Carson is a poet who actually taught at the U of M for a lot of her career. But the fact of the two young boys falling in love, including like when they are like 14 and 16 is when they first meet, is like just as matter of fact and kind of like taken as nothing out of the ordinary as Geryon having wings is just as kind of matter of fact and not taken out of the ordinary. Actually, the fact that he has wings is remarked upon. The fact that these two young boys fall in love is just sort of a like, that's just what happens. It's not ever commented on. And I think like that has just always struck me as being really special about the book, because so much, like especially stuff written in 1998, it would be like such a trauma, you know, about it. And there is like trauma and sadness in their love story, but it's just the trauma and sadness of being 14 and being in love, you know, and then having your heart broken. It has nothing to do with like being gay. So I loved it. I think it's beautiful. Different parts of it just get to me each time in different ways. She wrote a follow-up book, Red Doc, that came out a few years ago. That one I've only read once. It didn't quite grab me in the same way. I might read it again now that I've just finished this one. Maybe I'll read it again and see if it touches me differently this time. Lucy, do you want to go?
Yes. So the book I'm going to choose is a book by Jane Yolen. It's called Finding Baba Yaga. I don't know if you can really see that there. So, and it says a short novel in verse. Jane Yolen is the author of over 400 books. She's won a ton of awards, but most recently she won the Sidney Taylor Body of Work Award, which recognizes an author who has made a substantial contribution over time to the genre of Jewish children's literature. And she has been called the Hans Christian Andersen of American children's literature. So this book takes it's like a contemporary retelling of this myth of Baba Yaga, which is a big part of Russian folklore, but I think in other Eastern European folklore as well. And she takes a contemporary story and then mixes it with this folktale. So it's the story of this teenage girl who is fleeing an abusive home, and then she ends up taking refuge in the woods with this fairy tale witch, Baba Yaga. And it's a story that is really interesting because it's a retelling of a fairy tale, but then it also has this unique new perspective on it. And it's narrated entirely by Natasha. So she's weaving these two tales together. What's interesting about it is like the Baba Yaga parts are kept exactly as the Baba Yaga story is. Like, she has got a house that walks on chicken feet. She flies around in a mortal that's driven by a big pestle, which is like all of that comes from the original folktale. But then she has this personality that Jane Yolen is giving her that's really interesting. And she sort of accepts Natasha into her home rather than like eating her or casting her out, or all the many things that these witches in folktales have done before. And this really paints this picture of like creating this female space where Natasha is now sort of empowered somewhere. She does, she's helpful to Baba Yaga, so she gets to stay on. And that's pretty interesting as well. And so I loved the idea of like taking this traditional folktale and really subverting it. And this is something that Jane Yolen does a lot. Like, she just deconstructs fairy tales a lot. And she has this idea, like right in the beginning, she says, you think you know this story, but you don't, because stories retold are stories remade, which is so true when you think about like the oral tradition of folktales and folktales and storytelling in general, is each time a story is told, there's the potential for it to change. And because Jane Yolen is a poet, among other things, she's written a lot of children's books, she's written adult books, she's written nonfiction and fiction, but she is also a poet. So this book is comprised of these amazing poems, and it is a tale told in verse, but it also could be read, I feel, as a collection of poetry. And so there's just these parts where you're reading it and that you kind of get, like there's a certain combination of words that just really strikes you. And so I enjoy that about it too, because I feel like you could dip in and out and just read any part of the verse as a single poem. One thing that Jane Yolen does that's really interesting with her poetry is she has this, it's part of Saving America's Immigrants, one poem at a time. And you can sign up for it. She will email you a poem a day that she's written throughout like her entire body of work. Some of them are recent, some of them are older, but all she asks of you to do is to read one of her books a month. So get it from the library, buy it, borrow it from a friend, but it's just like this trade. And it starts from like this group in Massachusetts where she lives. They would write poems and they'd sort of auction them off, and that would go to helping immigrant cultures in the area. So there's sort of so much in this like really short book, knowing both Jane Yolen's history as an author and the interesting way that she's taken this really traditional tale that sort of crops up everywhere. And even if it's not Baba Yaga specifically, the idea of this witch in the woods is just in so many stories. So I loved the combination of the modern with the old, and I thought the poetry was beautiful. So that is Finding Baba Yaga by Jane Yolen. Christopher, what do you have?
Well, I also picked something Russian themed, in fact, in Russian. This is Yevgeny Onegin, or as people in English call it, Eugene Onegin. And it was written by Pushkin and translated by Stanley Mitchell. This is kind of Russia's literary bedrock, and don't tell anyone I had never read it before last week. This is a great excuse to finally read this book in verse. It really tells the story of Onegin, who is, he's rich, he's of the upper class, he's smart, he's an idler, he spends his time with his amorous conquests and idling his days away. He moves to the country, befriends his neighbor, kind of flirts with his neighbor's fiance. Then Onegin challenges or is challenged to a duel, kills his best friend, and there's another woman involved. And what happens is she professes her love to Onegin, he spurns her, and at the close of the book, he finds her again many years later. She's married, still in love with him, but she spurns him. The end. So it's kind of sad, really, especially with Onegin killing one of his only friends in the world, and then this kind of fatalistic, doomed love affair. So it touches on all these ideas of love and friendship and aging and how to live a good life and fate. And it really introduced into Russian literary lore the idea of the superfluous man, who is someone who really has no purpose in life and who is kind of bored with everything. I do not envy anyone who tries to translate this, because it has a very particular rhyme scheme. And then to have to make the translation rhyme seems like a particular kind of pleasure or torture, depending on how much you love finding different words. So I have to say, there are parts of it that I find a little bit sing-songy, and I can't tell how serious I should take it. And other parts are just so beautiful and moving. But again, I read it in a translation, so many Russians would scoff at anything translated like that. But I was really happy to read it and loved it a lot. Also, I just wanted to mention, Evelyn, I didn't find out from you just now whether Gurion is killed by Heracles or not, and you don't have to tell us. But the fact that one of his tasks is to kill him kind of reminded me a lot of Onegin and his neighbor friend, who he kills because of this duel that he has.
Yeah. Well, it's not spoiling anything to say that he in the myth he does, and in the book it says, like, in the very beginning it says he does, but this book ends before that happens.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of starts with, like, the way the book is written is interesting, because it starts with, like, the style of poetry is written a little bit different in the very beginning, and then it goes into kind of, it's more like more of how it's written throughout, and then it kind of switches back at the very end to this, like, interview. And anyway, so it says, like, in the very beginning that he was killed by him, but it doesn't say, but the main part of the book ends before that happens.
Right, I see. Okay. Well, there you have our 4 books in verse, very different. What a great selection of books we have today. As always, we would love to hear your comments and find out what you're reading. You can leave us a note in the section below. And until next time, happy reading.